Hello, audience and esteemed guests. Welcome to episode 17 of our Decoding AI in Healthcare series. I am Dr. Harshita Gupta, your host. So, without any further delay, let's dive into today's discussion by introducing our esteemed panelists. First up, we have Sasha Dagayev, CEO and co founder of tinybio. He and his team help people write life science experiments using generative AI. His educational background is Masters of Science from NYU in Bioinformatics with a focus on ML applications. Prior to working in bioinformatics, Sasha worked in many New York-based startups and co-founded a consultancy called Factorial Digital, which he and his business partner sold in 2019. Welcome, Sasha.
Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, next we have, next joining us is Dr. Dipu Patel, a digital health consultant. Dr. Dipu's expertise lies in her remarkable fusion of clinical acumen and a deep understanding of technology's role in empowering patients through education and advocacy. Welcome, Dipu.
Thank you so much, Harshita. Thank you to our audience and welcome to episode 17.
Yeah. So with such an esteemed panel, I am truly excited to commence today's webinar on transformative impact of AI in life sciences. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Harshita. Welcome, Sasha. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think this is an area of AI that we don't get to have a deep dive in terms of conversations and how much it's actually going to impact the back end work, if I may say, in healthcare, right? It's the unseen, unsung heroes of what happens behind the scenes for us. So, well, why don't we start with what you think the basic state of basic research is in tech stack today?
Yeah, so I would say that a lot of so we run our service called tinybio, which helps scientists write a lot of the research. What we don't do is we don't take somebody's, unformed idea and transform it into something miraculous, with a simple prompt. Typically what we see, the way that we see scientists use the service today is a wet lab scientist that doesn't understand what they received from the computational team, either at their hospital or in their research organization, and they use our services to help explain it to them. Now, the second part of that, we're also enabling folks to do is, they got some piece of information, they're able to use us to ask questions about it, but now they're also able to use us to write the code to understand it further. Right. So they'll take like a question that they'll like a broad question like, hey, for this specific variant that a patient has, what is the response rate to what was the response rate in this clinical trial based on the data that you provided? Right. Now, that's a fairly complicated question. But for us, where the Gen AI application can really perform like, something very, very new is that it distills that into Python or R code that is then run and kind of helps you answer the question for you.
Yeah. So if we can break this down piece by piece for those in our audience who are not familiar with what you were saying in terms of wet lab and whatnot. So basically, and please correct me and jump in. We're looking at a study that was done, for example, on let's say I'm going to use COVID sequencing for lack of a better, perhaps something a little more pertinent to current times. And so you have a study that was done that said, here's the sequencing of this COVID strain. Here is the effectiveness of XYZ medication on this strain. Tell me what relevancy this is or how effective this is. And when for our audience, in terms of a wet lab, when this is done at the bench side, what we're looking at is the actual running of the software to sequence this RNA or DNA, whatever we're looking at in terms of. And then what is the ability to take that study, write sequential code that will either match it or maximize it. Am I kind of following you?
Yeah, you're straight on. The number one place where, so usually, when people talk about Gen AI and generative AI applications, is that they pretend that the people that are in their work environment have never worked there before. Usually, you don't just wake up and then, and one day you're in a COVID-19 setting, right? You're usually, if you're studying it or if it's in your part of day to day, you have some context to your day to day. And a lot of the times is that, especially in clinical applications, people don't communicate well. And the
for all our training, our communication skills need help.
And even between themselves, right? So between the researcher and the person who's actually doing who's trying to apply some of the studying. So what we're seeing is that it's a lot of like explain it like I'm five questions, where it's like, okay, you told me that there's some effect here. Can you explain? And it uses Gen AI to use services like ours to kind of like explain and say like, hey, dumb it down for me. You know what I mean? Like explain it like I'm five. And the great thing about Gen AI is that people don't get there's none of that like fear of asking a dumb question. You know what I mean? Like a lot of what we see is like people asking very, very simple questions for a computational perspective, because that's just not what their background was in, right? Now, in a real world setting, like fundamentally, a lot of the people that we work with have been in school for 12 years, 16 years, and they get very apprehensive about asking questions. Gen AI, like for whatever reason, there's none of that apprehension. And I feel like culturally, that's like a killer feature of these services, is that they make it okay, culturally okay to ask maybe a question that you wouldn't have asked, or to ask 4 or 5 follow-up questions where, in real life, a lot of times you might feel embarrassed. You might feel, like, oh my God, I'm wasting this person's time. So that's like one of the places where we see, especially with, folks that don't interact in our research world and how they interface with researchers. It's like, you can keep asking this thing. It's not going to bed, it'll continue to try to kind of like re-explain it to you and stuff like that.
And it is one of the nice things. It lowers the barrier for asking those questions so that you can then learn. And I'll use myself as an example. I've kind of played around on your website. And so for our users, what you could do is actually plop in a PDF of a study into their onto their webpage, and you can ask it, tell me what this study, is this useful? Would it be useful in the context of this? What was the software that was used to analyze XY or sequence XYZ RNA? And I'm not a researcher by background, but I can see as the recipient of the research that can be generated from this, and as a clinician and an educator, I can see the practical implications of really using this all the way from bench to bedside, because this is really going to shorten that pipeline for us in terms of understanding and increase the number of people who can really understand this at a level where something that may have been theoretical, like molecular chemistry for me, I can now start grasping at least the larger concepts of what we're doing here. I know about sequencing. Do I know how to do it? No. But I can at least now appreciate what it's going to bring and how it will impact the patients that I will care for in the future. So
and the biggest thing, honestly, is from a communications perspective, right? In terms of like breaking down, silos within your healthcare or within your research organization, is that one of the things where we saw a dramatic increase in the quality of our services is when we changed our generative logic to try to keep the language at an 8th grade level.
That's very interesting. Digital literacy is a key component of all of this, and keeping it at a level where we all understand it. Absolutely.
Exactly. Right. And that was like one of the things that I saw from my, from my previous startup background, is that the content that performed best was the content that was written at an 8th grade level. That was like the perfect like altitude where it has the maximum impact. You're not using words like, in literature, a lot of the stuff that we read uses things like putative, and it's like, what is the point? What do we all have PhDs, like everyone understands that, like everyone's very smart, like we get it, you know what I mean? Just there's so many simpler ways to say that you've proven this thing to be right. And so that's what we see is like the biggest kind of like killer thing that people, because the demos that we see, people show, it's always like, hey, you turn, a 5-letter request into a 5-word request into something magical. In reality, those demos are mostly like fake or 1 in 100, right? In practical situations where we see like the real uses is the translation of something very complicated or a simple implementation of the code, right?
I mean, I will say, like, as an educator and as a clinician, this excites me on a number of levels. One, I've already explained in terms of how we can use this to better understand what we're doing for our patients, and really elevating our game as clinicians in the realm of personalized and precision medicine. It really adds a depth of layer to my knowledge and understanding for what I can do to help patients from a treatment point of view. But as an educator, it excites me because here I am now, I'm going to be able to take something like tinybio and say to my students, go put in a study and see what you can learn from it, and really start planting the seeds of curiosity for them to say, you may not know this from the curriculum that we're developing, but if you're really curious about it, here's a way you can really leverage your skills and medical know-how. So I think that's it. And I guess in that vein, my next question would be, what other important use cases do you see for or applications do you foresee for the technology that you're developing?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do right now is, like, from a education perspective, right? I just like where we see a huge boon is from just being able to create workflows that are very, very simple to understand what the heck happened, right? I went to NYU. I have a rigorous education in the bioinformatics space. A lot of the bioinformatics papers that I personally read, I don't understand the method section. I'm like, I don't understand what you did here. I don't, and I'll look at the code and the code doesn't run. And I'm like, what the heck? You know what I mean? Like, who is this for? You know what I mean? Like, you publish this content, who is this for? And it's an odd situation because reproducibility for researchers is not something where there's a lot of practical money behind. Most of researchers, the way that they keep their labs alive is they gotta fill a grant and get to that next grant, and you don't get grants for reproducibility. What we would love to do is to use Gen AI to lower the cost of reproducibility and really add it as a sanity rigor. For one, and the reason why we want to do it is we want to make your paper much more explainable to a larger audience, and we want to fit it to whatever altitude that audience member is, right? Because for researchers, for any research paper, the audience is very bimodal. And what I mean by that is that there are people that really get it, and these are people that are typically going to be the ones reviewing your paper, and they're going to want it to be more complicated. Most of the people that are reading the paper and could really learn something want it to be simpler, right? Right. Right now, we're only catering to that top 10% of the understanding crowd, right? Where we're really trying to get that paper pushed through, and we're trying to get those smart, really bright people to understand what the heck we're talking about. But in reality, what we want to do is we want to use Gen AI to take what these really smart folks are saying and make it accessible for everybody else, right?
Level the
in a way that, yeah, because like, so the average paper is written at a like grade 16 level. If we look at, like, I know from my personal personally, English is a second language for me. A lot of my coworkers in bioinformatics, English was a second language. That's not realistic. You know what I mean? It's just not a realistic thing. Things are going to get lost and things like that. And like the fact that we're keeping this kind of like facade of trying to like making it more exclusionary is not really needed, right? And so what we hope to do is use generative AI software to construct workflows that, one, make it very easy to understand, hey, here's what happened. And if you want to interrogate that workflow, you don't have to understand the alignment algorithm in and out for star versus high sat versus salmon. Those are just alignment softwares. Right. To understand what the heck happened, right? Like we want to make it more accessible so that way folks really understand kind of like what the heck's going on.
Yeah. I think you touched on what I was going to ask about the reproducibility crisis, right? One of the hardest things that researchers have is, great, you have a study that came out. Now you have to prove it over and over again in order for it to be well vetted well enough so that it can be implemented in the human population. And this kind of helps not expedite the process, but perhaps make it a little bit more efficient, because you have one understanding, and also, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you also provide other ways to reproduce it.
Yeah, so the killer thing is that right now the ecosystem of software that you can use to analyze and interrogate your data is pretty vast. But underneath that code, all of these softwares use a wide variety of mathematical methods that are technically all valid and are all published methods, right? Meaning that they went through peer review. However, when you run the same piece of code trying to accomplish the same objective, you get different results based on the software stack that you use. And so no one's running all of their samples through the entire ecosystem of software. So no one's building a confusion matrix that shows, hey, we ran this through every single, widely available software stack. And we were able to prove that, yes, in fact, in this population set, for people that took this medication, their, expression of this gene was higher. No one's doing that. People are selecting the one pathway the one workflow that their grad intern wrote 3 years ago that still miraculously works. You know what I mean? And it kind of runs, you know what I mean? It runs, it gets the job done. Everybody wants to go home and stuff like that. And so with Gen AI, obviously it's like, if you give researchers, if you give medical professionals a bicycle, what we're hoping to do is that they actually do we're hoping that it makes doing that work of, hey, I'm going to see if this actually reproduces in other software, the effect that I'm seeing. And it's not just a artifact of the tools that I've been using.
Yeah. And it actually makes the tools, as to your point, accessible, but learn code to be able to extrapolate what I need to know as a clinician. And it's leveling the playing field, democratizing access to these things, whatever phrase we want to use. It's making it easier for us to use the tools and leverage them for patient care ultimately at the end of the day for patient care.
Yeah, and a lot of the things is that like there's a lot of bioinformaticians that are extremely talented at what they do. Unfortunately, right now, when we did user research, a large of retrieving the data. So what that means is that, hey, we're filling out a new grant. I need you to pull XYZ data, right? No one gets satisfaction from
it
that
is
work.
quite possibly
You know what
the
I mean?
most boring task of the entire cycle.
Exactly. Right. And that's what where a lot of the energy goes towards, is to kind of do that stuff. And that, like, again, this is like where the demos meet practicality, is that practically, you know what I mean? That's the problem that we're trying to solve, is that when the principal investigator is like, hey, can you make the chart more up and to the right by excluding these genes? Because I'm trying to, focus the grant committee on this specific problem. In reality, we know that that's a lot of the tasks that goes on in these institutions, right?
And which can be automated now.
We think, which was what we're aiming to kind of make a lot faster, so that way the bioinformaticians can work on the stuff where Gen AI is not going to do a good job, right?
Right.
Because where it actually is like quite poor is at novel things, right? Because fundamentally, right, is that is that like the fundamental kind of like learning from ChatGPT and all these systems is that there's actually quite a big statistical pattern to a lot of the human knowledge capital that we produce. And if you're doing something new, the system's not going to know kind of like that new piece of idea or that new that new bit. The good thing for a lot of busy work is that busy work actually gets done a lot, right? A lot of people spend a lot of time doing a lot of busy work that no one enjoys doing. And so that's kind of like where a lot of these systems, I think, will do a great job of helping folks and give them a bicycle to kind of move beyond that and do work that's actually at it.
When I think back on some of the work that goes on at the research level, I haven't done much research, but I have colleagues who have. And one of the most painful aspects of the research is, especially in healthcare, as clinicians, we are horrible at creating spreadsheets that are actually usable. And there's a lot of cleaning that goes on and scrubbing and making it pretty so that we can use it. And so I have a lot of colleagues who work in research, and they're like, you healthcare providers really don't know how to make data pretty. And we spend all our time really trying to put it in a format that is usable, which, again, to your point, this is exactly what will help Gen AI and these sort of processes that's what it's good at. That will open up the researchers to actually do the research and practice to the top of whatever degree they have earned. Because right now what they're doing is turning, words to numbers right now is what they're doing.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's where that's really where we're seeing like that's really kind of like the practical applications of where we think the next 5 to 10 years are really going to be impactful in people's lives, is that, hey, your job's going to get a lot less boring.
Yeah. So do you think that what do you think AI will do now for demand for research and researchers, I guess, and like what do you foresee as some challenges and benefits of it? Because we all know that AI has already impacted workforce in every industry, but I think in research particularly it will have a pretty big impact.
Yeah, so typically when people get good at research, they want more of it. Because there's an immense return on capital for a lot of the people that are putting the money into these things, right? Right now, given the aside from like that famous figure where it's like, hey, it's 2.6 billion or whatever to get a drug to market, there's a whole slew of other costs that are associated with the actual human capital that is involved in getting to that point. We are, once that gets, you know, as you drive down the basic cost to kind of like get to kind of like survivability for a research organization, you're going to see a lot more research organizations sprout up, right? Because the amount of capital to start and to get to that first point in the clinical process, you're going to see it go from, you know, where you needed a team of 20 people, now you need a team of 5 people, right? And the good thing about that is that it's going to just, it is that the number of 5-person teams is going to explode.
That's what I was about to say. I was about to say that. I think right now we have researchers concentrated in certain areas, especially in healthcare at large institutions, universities, you know, and then areas, other aspects or areas of the country that don't have access to it, or globe. I think this will make it a little bit more accessible to the areas that don't have it. And you're right, like, it's not that the jobs of someone who is hiring 20 researchers, the 20 researchers will still have jobs, they will just be in different areas. And we'll see an increase of
fundamentally, like institutions like an NYU will see competition from 5-person teams, where before the competition was, hey, Columbia, you know, Cornell. Now it's going to be, oh my God, these guys, these 3 people were able to accomplish so many things, right? And those teams of 3 are going to explode, right?
Do I dare say AI will make research sexy again, you know, forever?
Because it won't be,
I think it's going to really help. I think and because I think we're going to see research in through a different lens, at least from healthcare providers. It's not just going to be, what is the medication that went to market and, you know, how long it took us. It's going to be everything. It's going to be genetics. It's going to be social. It's going to be environmental. We're going to see research explode from all of these areas that are really going to impact how AI is going to change the way we see research from a traditional lens, because it's not just A to B. Now we're going to have, I think it's going to be the other way around, to be honest.
Hi, and if you look
welcome.
Hi, Amit.
Hi, Dipu, Sasha, fantastic discussions going on so far. It's so glad to be back at the podcast. So while you guys were having the discussion, I kind of took the liberty of exploring the website so that, you know, I can come back with some background knowledge on what Sasha and his team is working. And it's a fantastic work that you're doing out there. So can we call it like we're going to be looking at AI assistant data analyst for a researcher?
Yeah, that's one way to call it. I mean, the killer, kind of like the killer use cases for that we see folks using it today is like translating like existing code of like what the heck happened, bugs, right? So nobody knows, like a lot of, you know, people don't know like error codes, which is totally normal. Why? You don't need that information. And then number 3 is like really like a Kickstarter. So a lot of like, hey, you know, like in terms of bioinformatics analysis, I would say that like 50% of analysis today is focused on RNA expression, whether that be in single cell environment or in bulk RNA-seq environment. And a lot of that we can be your step 1, where, hey, we're going to give you the boilerplate, and then you kind of like make the changes yourself, right?
Okay, so I have one question to you that comes to my mind. So when you're talking about taking the data in the domain of life science, or let's be a little more specific, healthcare research, how are you dealing with 2 contexts? One is, of course, data privacy and the transparency of the AI model that you're using to generate the output. So how are you framing that in whatever you've built?
Yeah, so a lot of the, so if you have, so data legislation around AI does not change now because AI exists. We
Yeah, of course.
will like, but you have to respect the healthcare privacy organizations, that the privacy rules that those organizations have, right? So there's a subset of data in that the NIH provides in a database called the SRA, which is
Mm-hmm.
essentially a database of NIH funded experiments that then they release their public data, and it's accessible without a login to everybody, right?
Yeah, open
So that
research, yes.
so that is kind of like, so when you import data in using tinybio, that's kind of like the primary data source that we use.
Mm-hmm.
For data that is private, a lot of these institutions, NYU, I'll talk about NYU because that's the institution that I know, they have on-premise cloud computers, right? So they
Right.
are able to run a lot of these uh, models on their own stack. What that means is that whatever privacy data protections that NYU or
Yeah,
that organization has, that's what it's going to be, right? Like the
yeah.
software runs in there,
In there,
in there.
got it.
Yeah. So that's like, so from that perspective, nothing really like it. I understand why people get, you know, get apprehensive about these things, right? But that's just the reality of it, is that like no one's gonna change it, right? So we have to kind of like adapt to the privacy concerns that folks have. Now, for tinybio specifically, we, it's on the users to know, like, do not like,
Don't put
if
your
you
own
work
stuff
in a research context, right, you have to know, hey, what is the, like, I can't, like, when I was working, right, like I knew that, hey, certain data had to stay inside of NYU, certain
Yeah,
data, doesn't have the same protections, right? And so that's just, it's, the the biggest security flaw is always is always in the hands of the user,
between the
so,
humans. Yeah, the
yeah.
security flaws are in the
yes.
So
human.
yeah, but
Yeah.
fundamentally, right, like for a lot of our corporate clients, it's all about setting up a local model. So these
Yeah.
local models are not as performant as OpenAI's model, but they're pretty good for a lot of what they're looking for. And the killer feature of being focused on biological research is that, when somebody asks about Picard, which is a software from MIT for call, for specific variant calling, we know
Yeah.
that you're talking about biological software and not Star Trek, and so it kind of makes our problem, significantly simpler to, we don't need the entire power of something like GPT-4 to answer those questions.
So Sasha,
Yeah.
do you foresee a shift? I mean, I know right now we're all focused on large language models and using all of these to kind of, do you foresee, and I think in healthcare, Amit and I have had this discussion on a number of occasions, that we will see a shift over the next 5 to 10 years and towards small language models. We've started to see a little bit of it, but like regional, perhaps even institutional, kind of like NYU has models that are trained within their own proprietary blend, so to speak, to use coffee terms. But
Yeah.
do you foresee that kind of happening?
Yeah, so I actually foresee something kind of like more radical, where the iPhone local large language model is going to be more impactful, I think, for a lot of what we're seeing than most
Interesting.
people kind of like foresee. Right now, Apple published a paper on some kind of like very small directed use cases where they outperform GPT-4. And the purpose of this large language model is that it's going to, everyone kind of, following the signs, is that it's going to run locally on a person's iPhone or MacBook Pro. And so I think that is going to be much more like the interesting story of like, hey, like this large this thing has the best data, about the person and about a lot of the other things. I actually think that healthcare institutions will work with will that like in 3 to 5 years, institutions will work with companies like OpenAI and Google and Azure to use their models, because they're going to see the reality of the amount of resources and the amount of specialized talent that it takes to kind of spin up a blend of what you're saying, right? And that, the lawyers are going to get involved, but there'll be some sort of level of comfort around like how the data gets moved and how it gets siloed, so that way it's not in the blend that goes into the public data sets that are open on ChatGPT.
We are starting to see some partnerships kind of forming.
That is coming. But it's a very interesting perspective you've just put there. And let me just throw that to you guys another perspective. We always feel that, we always judge a large language model kind of based on their GPU strength on which it is built, the number of parameters that it is built, not really looking much into the foundation model or the foundation training, the data set that is being used to train on. Let's say, for example, if I can be very specific, like, we use so much of OpenAI's GPT-4, for doing so much of health related work, where we all know that the foundation model is a general foundation model. It's not at all a medical LLM, as if you compare that with the MedPalm 2. So maybe down the line, like something that you're building, it's like whatever you're building it on, you're building it specific to the use case of research. And I would find it much more valuable, much more transparent, much more realistic and coherent and relevant in giving the output, rather than using a sort of a general large language model. So what I mean to say is we always be taken by the GPU strength, but sometimes we should also look at the data set and the foundation on which the foundation model has been built.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the counterintuitive things about these models, is that everyone in the ML class, always talked about what you're saying. In reality is that the general models have been outperforming the specialist models right now.
They do because of the strength of the
and so
parameters.
It's like,
yes, agree.
And so it's like we can, like, what you're saying makes a ton of sense, and then you're hit with this like reality of like the big reason why, in this OpenAI Elon Musk court case, the big reason why OpenAI said that they were going to become a private company, not a charity, whatever weird thing that they, was because they had this realization, was that they were like, oh my God, the general world model is just gonna be better, at least for now. And that we just need to suck up as many GPUs as possible for these things. Now, this may change, right? Right now, there's a lot of people that are doing different, or are not using transformer models. There's other, the most popular one is a Mamba, it's called. Supposed to be the next big thing. We'll see. But for right now, in the transformer architecture world, it seems counterintuitively is that the general world model is doing a better job than
and then you just need to put some wrappers all around it and kind of get your own creative model. So Sasha, the next point I wanted to kind of bring you in, and you can throw some light on this, because that's one domain that as clinicians, as healthcare providers, we've been kind of very intrigued to see how that comes up, especially in the domain of epidemiology, is the use of synthetic data. So give us a through on that. How is your system, or what your build is going to support developing synthetic data in a very transparent way with more accurate, predictions and predictive analytics coming up?
Yeah, so the use of synthetic data is probably the best way to fight back against like the kind of like the data moats that big tech has. And everyone who has been training models has said that the use of synthetic data is the best, is the best way to kind of like close the gap. For in terms of like workflows that we're developing, we can support the en masse creation of synthetic graphs. So a lot of so if you wanted to say like, hey, I would like, I know like for when you guys look at, for example, signatures, cell signatures of blood, right, where they transform it on a UMAP or something like that. There's countless limitations, right? And so we can either use real ones, or we can just generate them, and generate them on a massive scale. And that's where we can use a system like our system to kind of like tweak the parameters of the inputs for those graphs in a systematic way that can attack kind of, the interpretation of that type of data, right?
Yeah. I do think that synthetic data is going to be the new, it's the new wave, I think, in how trials are going to be done in the future.
Yeah, like the most advanced, everything is kind of everything that everyone else is experiencing right now with AI. The self-driving people have experienced 2 years ago. So if you want to understand kind of like where we're going, like look at what they're doing, that's what everyone else is going to be doing in 2 years, right? So like a lot of their GPU capacity goes towards kind of like what you guys are saying, is that they simulate people driving and stuff like that rather than kind of, and they're simulating the use cases that they have difficulties with.
Right.
So I guess it's been a very good discussion. You've given us a very good overview about, how in bioinformatics, so should we call this a bioinformatics GPT? I mean, of course, we shouldn't use the word GPT in that way, but of course, I mean, it's the way people look at it these days. So tell us, Sasha, I mean, we have a mixed audience listening to us. Sometimes when this goes out on YouTube, we have a lot of people in the tech world. Maybe there is somebody who's getting inspired by you to build up, a bioinformatics model, a machine learning model. So tell us, how does someone start with this? How does someone survive with this? And like, what's like, the ecosystem at the moment, and how do you see the shift in the ecosystem happening as more and more AI adoption happens in the world of research, statistics, and technology?
Yeah, so as always, start on YouTube. Like that's the best place to start.
I think my kids would agree.
Yeah. We can fight the Zoomers, but they are right about some things. Is that, it's just a fantastic resource, right? I would really lean into using, if you're building an AI service, use as many AI services as you can, particularly because you'll understand kind of like a lot of the early use cases and where it does a really good job and where it does a not so good job. And then lastly, I would say is that if you're developing if you're new to development and you're using a lot of AI powered tools, is that using a stack that is a bit older is going to be a boon for your productivity if you're very AI tool dependent. The reason is because there's a lot more of that content in the training data sets of the AI tools that you will be using. One of the odd things that I saw is that, a web framework that was really wasn't as popular on Twitter is getting popular again. And I notice is because that's the one that ChatGPT always recommends, right? And it's an older one, but it made up so much of the corpus of what it was trained on. And the answers that it gives for that framework are usually pretty freaking good because it's well solved and well understood. So I would say, like, from a knowledge perspective, I would say YouTube is definitely very, very, very accurate, especially like if you're using big tech services, they invest a ton of money in developer advocate resources, and they like use those tools, right? You use them and really like they're really, really good.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. It's such a simple way of kind of learning this area.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree. I think Amit and I would both say that we've learned a lot from watching YouTube videos ourselves. And
Yeah.
Again, it's an opportunity in a way to reduce the barrier to knowledge, right? I mean, I think we all had AI 2-3 years ago in our heads as something so 50 years into the future, yet here we all are, and embracing it and learning it. And that learning curve has been an amazing learning curve for me. You know, I'm grateful to have the resources that I have. But you're right, the bigger companies, when they put some resources into this and they're creating those are really great ways to add to your learning, or at least start with the foundations of what you want to kind of build on.
Yeah. And the thing is that like what you have to understand is that their incentive structure is for you to use the tool, right?
Yeah.
And so they have metrics that say like, hey, this tutorial was effective in pushing somebody to use the tool or not. Whereas in a lot of academic resources, what I found was that the incentive is for you to buy the thing. It's for you to buy the course. It's not as much for you to complete it, right? In the developer advocate tooling that big tech puts out, the incentive is very much for you to use the tool, right? So the communication is usually very, very clear, and there's a ton of support if you fall down between the cracks as you're moving along your journey.
Thank you.
Just to add to all our viewers out there, I mean, you know, what Sasha and, you know, folks in his domain, they're building is something actually is going to sort of do a lot of good to us in health science and medical science. I mean, even a few months back or maybe a year back, we could not imagine, you know, fiddling with some research tools, some no-code tools. But with generative AI, you have so much of extractions happening and generations happening, and that kind of automates a lot of complex processes. And that's what somebody like Sasha has developed in his platform, and many more. I'm sure they're doing. And as we go along, we will be seeing much more developments and automation coming, which basically kind of encourages somebody like me who understands nothing of statistics, nothing of, you know, these kind of analytics, because I've been a clinician throughout my career. And that kind of gives me a much upper hand when I have my data set and I want to fiddle with it and sort of go and explore into your system. So, I mean, you guys are really doing a lot of service to mankind, I would say.
I hope so.
Perspective. Yes, of course. And we it's an ecosystem that we are building. And I think it's all a drop at every level. And we all need to, you know, get into this together and do this.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining in today, Sasha.
Thank you for joining. Yes, exactly. I was just about to say thank you for taking time to join today, Sasha, and educating our audience on AI and life sciences and the impact that you're making. Here's to tinkering away on research data sets and making research sexy again. So
let's do it.
Thank you very much. And to our audience, join us again in a few weeks. We will have our next episode dropping. Otherwise, until then, have a good morning, good evening, and good afternoon.
Arshita?
Yeah. So as we bring this enlightening dialogue to its conclusion, a big thank you to Sasha, Dr. Dipu, and Dr. Amit for sharing their invaluable insights and perspectives. And audience, we appreciate you joining us today. So until next time, stay informed, stay inspired, and stay healthy. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Sasha.